plus interest, and it's happy, and everybody's good. Okay, so that there, having paid your debt to society and everything being okay makes sense. That is not the situation when somebody commits a crime. It's not like somebody says, well, I want to rob a liquor store, but it's against the law. And so they go to the government and they say, I'd like to rob this liquor store, but that's against the law. The government doesn't say, well, that's cool. Go ahead and rob a liquor store. But if you're caught, you're going to have to go to prison because you like to rob liquor stores. Well, just like banks like to make money, we like to lock people up and pay their room and board. And so that's what's in it for us. So go ahead and rob a liquor store. If we catch you, then we're going to put you in prison for some period of time. And then after that, though, we've gotten to keep you in prison and pay your room and board and all that stuff. And then we'll let you out, and you'll have paid your debts to society, and everything is okay. All right? That's not what's going on in the sentencing context. So this whole notion that once you've served your sentence, you've paid your debt to society, and that the slate is wiped clean and everything is okay, and all this hunky-dory is just not an accurate description of what's going on. There are two other arguments, though, that are somewhat more persuasive, but I think that they're persuasive only up to a point. One is that saying that people can never vote. Somebody writes a bad check, 50 years ago. That's a felony. But it's disproportionate. It's a disproportionate penalty to say that they can't vote today. Well, I would agree with that. But the way to address that problem is not to say, well, therefore, we're not going to have any kind of felon disenfranchisement for any felonies, no matter how recently committed they were, no matter what the felony was. What you do is you set up some kind of an administrative mechanism that says, okay, well, after you've served your time and you're not on probation, and you're not on parole, and you've shown that you've turned over a new leaf, we will restore your right to vote. And we will look at how recently the crime was committed, what the crime was, whether it was part of a series of crimes, all these kinds of things. And we'll also look at what you've done since then. That's the way to handle that problem. Likewise, another argument that is frequently made is that when somebody has committed a crime and they've gone off to prison and they've served their time and they come back out, we don't want to send the message that, you know what, we don't really care about you or your life or anything about you anymore. You are a non-person to us. You have made a mistake, and you are just scum. We don't care what you do from now on. You're not going to be, you cannot rejoin our society. All right. I agree that that is not a message that we want to send. I mean, that is unfair. But it's also bad for the public in general, because you want to create some incentives for people who've gone to prison and who've done their time and have come back to stay on the straight and narrow, and saying that their life is over and that they can never rejoin polite society is not a good message to send those people. But again, the way to do that is not to say that you automatically, the day you walk out of prison, or even while you're still in prison, are going to be allowed to vote. It seems like that if you want to send that message, that there is hope to reclaim your life, the way you do it is to the contrary. You say, all right, look, we know that you committed a crime and that was a bad thing, and we also know that recidivism rates are very high, in this country. We're not going to assume, against all the evidence, that you're never going to commit a crime again, because most people, once they're out of prison, do commit another crime. But if you go some period of time and show that you have turned over a new leaf, that is great. And we hope that you will do that. And if you do that, then we are here to ensure that you are welcomed back into society. We will help you find employment. We will help you find housing. We will have a ceremony, sort of like a naturalization ceremony, after some period of time, where you and people like you who have gone some period of time and have turned over a new leaf, you come down to the courthouse and we'll have a judge, and bring your family with you, and we will solemnly restore to you, your right to vote. That kind of process would be meaningful and would create the kinds of incentives that I think are good to have to reintegrate people into society. But you're not going to accomplish that if you just sort of automatically pretend that the crime was never committed. I think that that's a much better way to go about it. Well, I think I've talked for quite long enough, and with that, let me stop and entertain any questions or comments that you all have. Again, thanks very much for inviting me.
Questions? Well, I'm sure since I'm writing a paper on this, I can have some. Hans Spakowski wrote a letter to the editor of sorts a while ago saying how he did not, because of recidivism, he did not think that felons should automatically get them back, that they should go through a process. And I understand what he said and what you said, and respect that. My part is, a part of me just feels like if I had to pick the extremes, I would rather have felons vote in prison, which is just weird to me, than never voting again. I don't know, what do you think about that?
Well, it's a false choice. You don't have to pick between those two extremes. And I agree that it seems very weird on the one hand to allow people who are still in prison to vote. But it also seems to me that for all kinds of reasons, it's both unfair and I think probably not terribly wise public policy to say that people who've committed any felony can never vote again. We haven't really talked about sort of the different things that I would weigh and that I think are weighed. I think that obviously how recently the felony was committed is something that's relevant. I think that whether it's part of a series of felonies is something that is relevant. And I also think not all felonies are too. Somebody for instance committed treason. Maybe that should be a lifetime loss. Voting. Or somebody who has committed voter fraud on a wide scale basis. Maybe that person should never be allowed to vote again. Or some murder and rape. Maybe there are some crimes like that. Writing a bad check. That's different. Much is made of the fact that a fairly high percentage of people in prison, and particularly African Americans in prison, are in for drug-related offenses. I have sort of mixed feelings about that argument. First of all, the number of people, the percentage of people who are in prison for drug-related offenses is often, exaggerated. The overwhelming majority of people who are in prison are in state rather than federal prison, and the overwhelming majority of people who are in state prison are not in, for drug-related offenses. It's only if you sort of look only at federal prison that you see, these huge numbers. And I also think that it's not right to minimize the seriousness of a lot of drug-related offenses. We're not talking about people typically don't get sent to federal prison because they possess one joint of marijuana. I mean, it's usually trafficking, and often there's plenty of violence and other bad stuff that's that's involved. So I think that all of these things should be looked at in deciding whether to restore the right to vote. I mean, on the other side of the spectrum, I mean, I was on a panel one time, and the point is frequently made that a lot of foreign countries, in Europe and elsewhere, allow felons to vote when they're still in prison. And the point was made that the guy who assassinated, or I guess attempted to assassinate, the prime minister in Israel, was convicted and sent to prison. And the week after he got there, he was allowed to vote. And the guy who told this story was somebody who thought that the United States should have the same policy. And he was saying it was just wonderful, that the Israelis are so enlightened, and that they allow this, and shouldn't we be like that? And I just got up and said, yeah, that is just crazy. Here is somebody that is so contemptuous of the whole process, the whole government process, that he tries to kill, the leader, and then he wants to be able to vote. That's just crazy. Makes no sense at all. So yeah, I agree that that's crazy. I also, you can think of a lot of situations where somebody, has committed one, relatively minor, all felonies are major, but relatively minor, felony a long time ago. But say we don't have to choose between those two. I mean, I think that what it makes sense to do is to have a presumption that if you've committed a felony, you're not allowed to vote until you fully serve your sentence, and you've gone some period of time, depending, more or less period of time, depending on what the felony was, and then it's the right to vote is restored on a case-by-case basis.
And a sentence is not just incarceration; it's also probation.
Right. So, yeah, no, I would include that. In some places, you have to recompense the victim.
Sure. Yeah, to pay all fines. Yeah.
Right. Sure. I think that makes sense as well.
Any other questions? Yes.
The Democracy Restoration Act, is that on the books now?
No. No. I say it keeps getting proposed, but it doesn't pass.
What is it? What are we being restored to, or what's from?
Well, yeah, I guess the congressmen are quite ingenious in naming their bills, making them sound as attractive as possible. But I guess the idea is that if people are not being allowed to vote, then somehow we don't have democracy. And so, in order to restore it, we have to allow these folks to vote. As I say,
but we don't really have a democracy. I mean, a total democracy.
Well, right, exactly.
Anyway, so
yeah, no,
that's what I was wondering.
I agree.
That's not on the books. It's just something that's proposed now and again. Or...
Yeah, I mean, I'm not exaggerating when I say it's a perennial bill. I mean, the job I have now, I came to in 1997, and I think it was that year or the next year that I testified against it. And I testified against it, you know, a couple of years ago, and it keeps getting, you know, re-proposed. I think that, you know, obviously it stands a better chance of passage when the Democrats are in control of Congress than the Republicans are, which may be why I haven't been asked to testify lately, is that they figured that, well, there's really no point in having, you know, hearings on this bill. It's sort of interesting. You know, the reason that I was asked to testify originally was not really something that I knew a lot about, but I had written some about not the racial angle or the policy angle, but I had written about the scope of Congress's authority under Section 5 of the 14th Amendment. And so, and that was part of what, you know, Congress was asserting as a font of authority here. So I was asked to testify, and I said, okay, I would. And so I looked at that, and then you know, it's one of these, you know, one thing leads to another. Then I saw this other argument that was being used about the time, place, and manner of elections, so I had to read up on that. And then I, you know, discovered that what was really sort of driving this was the, you know, the racial angle to it. You know, I don't think we would be having this debate probably, you know, if the racial angle weren't in it. Although I think increasingly there's not only a racial angle, but there's also sort of a partisan political angle. You know, more and more data has come out, which actually was not around at the time when I testified, and it's not, it doesn't influence me one way or another, but, you know, rather unsurprisingly, the people who are disenfranchised by these laws tend to vote Democratic. So, you know, there is that sort of partisan, you know, angle to it as well. But, you know, I think that that's something that it's, you know, completely inappropriate for either side to consider. I mean, we shouldn't be deciding who votes based on how they're likely to vote. I mean, you know, if you know, you should decide what the qualifications for a good voter, you know, are, or, you know, what the appropriate qualifications are, and then let the chips fall where they may. But, you know, you shouldn't say, well, you know, this is a voting requirement that makes perfect sense, but I'm against it because they may not vote for me. I mean, that's not right.
Anything further? Well, thank you very much.
All right, thank you.